Sometimes the most revealing moments happen when nobody expects them. Kelly&Ripa wasn't sitting across from a therapist. She wasn't giving a farewell speech. She was simply marking 25 years on a show that made her one of the most recognizable faces in American television. And somewhere in the middle of that celebration, she said something quiet that felt much bigger than the milestone itself. She admitted, in her own words, that she doesn't plan on working for the rest of her life. It's such a small sentence on paper. But if you've spent any time watching Kelly&Ripa, really watching her, not just catching clips between commercials, you know that nothing she says on camera is ever as simple as it sounds. There's always something underneath it. And this time, what was underneath it felt like honesty breaking through the polish of 25 years in the spotlight. Let's sit with that for a second, because I think it's easy to scroll past a headline like this without really absorbing what it means. 25 years is not a short chapter. It's not a job. It's basically a life. Kelly&Ripa stepped into that studio chair back in 2001, next to Regis Philbin, as a relatively unknown actress stepping into an enormous pair of shoes. She was in her early 30s. She had young children at home. And in the decades since, she watched co-hosts come and go. Regis, then Michael Strahan, then Ryan Seacrest, while she remained the one constant heartbeat of that show. And now, at 55, sharing that chair with her own husband, she's the one telling audiences that even she has an expiration date on this chapter. That's the part that struck so many viewers. Not that she's leaving anytime soon. She didn't announce a departure date, and she was careful not to. But there's something deeply human about a person who has built an entire identity around a role finally admitting out loud that the role isn't the whole story of who she is. I think that's why this moment resonated so strongly. Because most of us, at some point, have to wrestle with the same question Kelly&Ripa is wrestling with in front of millions of people. When does the thing that defines you stop being the thing you want to keep doing? When do you let go of something you love, not because it stopped loving you back, but because you finally trust that life has more than one chapter in it? What made this admission even more interesting is the way she framed it. She didn't talk about burnout. She didn't talk about frustration with the industry or exhaustion, or wanting to disappear from public life. Instead, she talked about legacy. She described Live as a franchise, something bigger than any single host, pointing back through the decades to Regis and Kathy Lee before her, as if she understands in a very grounded way that she was always a chapter in someone else's book, not the entire library. That kind of perspective doesn't usually come easily to people who've spent a career being the center of attention. It takes a certain emotional maturity to say, essentially, this show will outlive me, and that's not a threat, that's the point. Many viewers noticed that instead of protecting her position, she seemed almost eager to talk about a future where new hosts get their own chance to build something with the audience. That's not a small thing to admit when you've spent 25 years being the audience's favorite. And this is where Mark Consuelos becomes such an important part of the story, even though the headline is technically about Kelly. Because you can't talk about her future on that show without thinking about what it means for the two of them as a pair. Mark stepped into that co-host chair in 2023, taking over after Ryan Seacrest's departure, and it changed the entire texture of the show. Suddenly, viewers weren't just watching two colleagues with good chemistry, they were watching two people who actually go home together, who raised 3 kids together, who have spent over 2 decades building an actual marriage in front of a camera crew that shows up for 2 hours every single morning. That's part of why this news feels different than a typical star teases exit story. It's not just a career decision. It's a decision that involves someone she has built a life with. If Kelly eventually steps away from that desk, it doesn't just change a show, it changes the daily rhythm of a marriage that has, somewhat unexpectedly, become one of the most publicly watched partnerships on daytime television. There's something worth noticing in how comfortable Kelly seemed discussing this with Mark right there beside her, week after week, on a show where he now shares equal footing. Some fans wondered whether this openness about stepping away eventually is easier for her precisely because she's not imagining walking away from a job. She's imagining walking toward more time with her family, more time with her husband outside of a studio audience, more time on her own terms. When you frame it that way, this isn't really a story about retirement. It's a story about what she's choosing to prioritize once the cameras eventually stop rolling for her. It's worth thinking about the timing too. This wasn't a random Tuesday interview. This came during a 25-year anniversary, a moment built for nostalgia, tributes, maybe even a few tears. And instead of only looking backward, Kelly used that spotlight to look forward, and to be unusually candid about doing so. There's something almost countercultural about that. In an industry that often pressures people to cling to relevance, to avoid ever admitting an ending is possible, she stood in the middle of a celebration of her own longevity and said, essentially, this won't last forever, and I'm at peace with that. That kind of honesty is rare in television. Hosts are trained to protect the illusion that the show is eternal, that nothing will ever change because uncertainty makes audiences nervous. But Kelly Ripa seems to understand something a lot of entertainers never fully grasp, that audiences don't actually need permanence to stay loyal. They need authenticity. And there's nothing more authentic than a person openly admitting they're human, that their priorities might shift, that even someone who seems to have the dream job in daytime television still dreams of a life beyond it. It also says something about how she's thought through what happens after she goes. She didn't just talk about leaving, she talked about wanting new co-hosts to have room to build their own connection with viewers, the same way she once did as a newcomer stepping in for Kathy Lee Gifford. That's not the mindset of someone clinging to a title. That's the mindset of someone who understands she was given an opportunity once, and wants to make sure that door stays open for someone else eventually. I think that's ultimately why this moment cuts a little deeper than a typical entertainment headline. It's not really about Kelly Ripa's contract or her schedule, or when exactly she might step away. It's about watching someone publicly make peace with impermanence, something almost all of us struggle with in our own, much smaller ways. Most of us don't have millions of viewers watching us wrestle with career transitions, but we all eventually face that same quiet question she seemed to be answering out loud. How do you know when to hold on, and how do you know when it's okay to imagine letting go? There's also something worth appreciating in the fact that she didn't frame this as an ending filled with sadness. It almost seemed like she was describing a future chapter with curiosity rather than dread, a life that might include more time with Mark away from the studio lights, more time simply being a wife and a mother rather than a broadcast personality performing that role for an audience every weekday morning. Whether that shift happens in 1 year or in 10, the tone she used suggests she isn't afraid of it. If anything, she seems to be preparing viewers gently, the way you'd prepare a friend for news before it becomes official. And maybe that's the real reason this story is spreading the way it is. It's not just because a beloved daytime host mentioned retirement in passing. It's because audiences have spent 25 years watching Kelly Ripa be honest, funny, occasionally a little chaotic, and always deeply herself on live television, and this felt like one more piece of that same honesty, just aimed at a harder, more personal subject than usual. Perhaps the reason so many people remain invested in Kelly&Mark isn't simply because they've spent decades in the spotlight together. It's because audiences continue to see something genuine in the way they navigate life, and now, apparently, the idea of eventually stepping away from that life side by side. And maybe that's why a moment like this stays with viewers long after the segment ends and the show cuts to commercial. So here's a question worth sitting with. If you'd spent 25 years building something the world associated entirely with you, would you have the courage to talk about letting it go, gently, honestly, without waiting for someone else to ask? Kelly Ripa just did exactly that in front of millions of people. What do you think it says about her, about their marriage, about the way she's chosen to handle fame for a quarter of a century? Drop your thoughts below, and if you've got a favorite Kelly&Mark moment from over the years, we'd genuinely love to hear it.